quite a few years ago, the Stops to Violence Network started to take a look at how do we address gender-based violence in our province, right? We're all in the room for this particular reason. And a look at systems, not formal institutional systems or paid systems where we all come from, but family and community systems. And a real recognition of the fact that most people who are at risk or who are experiencing or using violence go to folks that they know, or people that they know notice something going on with them. So that began our journey of how do we provide support, awareness, information, skills training to people that we call natural supports. So the folks that we're all in contact with in everyday life, whether it's neighbors, family, friends, people that we see when we go out in the world, folks like that. One of the things that we've been looking at is what exists, not so much for people who are experiencing and using violence, but for folks around those people. And there's some stuff, but not a whole ton. The other challenge is that me as a friend or family member may never have contact with those formal systems. So the likelihood of me getting what exists out there is less and less and less. So that started to place the question of, well, where are people having contact? How do we get to them? We talked about kitchen tables and car rides, places like that, and started to look for opportunities to connect with others who are doing this kind of work, which is how we met Sagesse and started to lean into this partnership. So the Real Talk program is part of this work that we're doing. What's different about it is it's live delivery. It's conversations with folks, and it's not a self-serve as much as some of the other resources are. So there's a lot of things out there where I can go on and independently learn, which is awesome. We're going to be working with those materials as well. But this creates an opportunity for us to go to people with some good conversation and learning and skill sets and tools. So this particular initiative is actually funded through the National Action Plan to End Gender-Based Violence, through the Women's and Gender Equality Department, Government of Canada, Ministry of Justice and Status of Women in Saskatchewan. So that's how this resourcing is coming about. As we walk through, I'm just going to drop something into the chat here. There's 3 ways that we'll be bringing this initiative into the province with Sagesse. One of them is open sessions, live sessions online that anyone can come into. So there's an element of anonymity and choice there if you aren't wanting to connect in your home communities. We are looking to work with specific communities on awareness building, and talking about how do we create invitations for people to learn in a way that they can say yes to, and working with prevention awareness at a community level. We're also going to be reaching to a couple of sectors. Trevor talked about energy sector. I see we've got Carrie here from SGEU, so maybe it's the union sector, and working specifically with those sectors just to see how we do that type of work as well. So this initial year is going to be a lot of learning together, building together, and then we'll continue from there. So just know that those are the options that we're looking at for the first 12 months or so. I've dropped Alyssa's contact information in there. So if you're interested in having a chat about us working specifically with your community around awareness and prevention, please reach out to her. So that's what I'll offer you in terms of how we all arrived into this room today. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, Tracy. So I will introduce the folks that will be speaking to us a little bit about this work. Give me 1 second to find Trevor too. There we go. So I'll introduce Trevor first. So Trevor is a descendant of settlers from Ontario and Alberta. Give me 1 second. He's interested in learning about his social position and that of others and trying to better align his actions with his convictions, and is currently studying for his Master's of Justice Studies program with the Royal Roads University. He's currently working in a domestic abuse field with Sagesse, of course, for over 2 years, and has been working in the homelessness disability field for 11 years in Calgary. He's committed to seeing if we can advance equitable social solutions for the wide array of social issues, and convinced that the solution will only be found through hard conversations facing truths about power and privilege and collective action. He also enjoys poetry, football, and his pack, his partner, and their bulldogs. That's Trevor. So Lian Tolentino, is that how? Yes, almost said it right, I think. Is Sagesse's provincial lead, like she said, responsible for leading the organization's operational focus and stopping abuse before it occurs. After joining Sagesse in 2020, Lian worked on the front lines as part of the Sagesse clinical team and then led the organization's volunteer team. In that role, Lian supported more than 100 volunteers and facilitated equitable-based workshops. She's then brought her passion for co-creation, feedback, and equitable practice to Sagesse innovation team as an implementation coordinator. A registered social worker, Lian also has previously worked in mental health care with youth and families and community outreach. So a wealth of hard work and knowledge. So we're grateful to have you here, and I'll pass the time over to you, and we'll have some discussion and questions as well after.
Thank you, Nova, and thank you, Tracy, for talking more about our partnership and what that looks like. I do have a couple of slides, and so before I even get started, I always like to do a little bit of housekeeping with everyone that I'm chatting with, just so that you know what to expect or how you can take care of yourself during this time. And so one thing I do want to say is that I may be sharing some slides and I may stop sharing slides. The only purpose of that is so that I can be a bit more accessible for folks that do like to have visuals when they have people talking. I am also okay if you are someone who just wants to put us in gallery view and see everyone's cameras. That's totally fine as well. And so just know, please do whatever you need for your engagement while we're together. My hope is that I can tell you more about Sagesse just in the act of trying to build more relationship with all of you, to know more about our organization. And then I'll pass it to Trevor so he can talk to you more about his experience as our Real Talk coordinator. We have a team, and like Jody introduced herself, she will be the primary facilitator in Saskatchewan. But we have lots of learnings and lots of things that we've experienced in our time here in Alberta that we are happy to share with all of you. So please don't hesitate to ask your questions, or since we are a smaller group, I don't always offer this up, but if you have questions as we are both speaking, just put your hand up and we're happy to pause. It's not going to ruin me and Trevor's flow by any means. And I'm speaking for you, Trevor, but I feel like that is really truly our Sagesse flow. So with that, please get comfy. And like I said, questions as we go, or you can save them till the end. We have plenty of time. So the first place I always like to go, even before I share my slides, is I'd like to tell you more a bit about myself. I know I've given you kind of the professional spiel about who I am and what I do, and I'd like to actually share with you all about how I've come to my informal supports work. And that really is rooted in the fact that, first of all, I am a first generation child of immigrants. I'm Filipino. My parents moved to Canada when I was 1 year old. And so from here, I've worked, played, lived in Treaty 7 territory. That's primarily where I've spent my life. And it's been interesting of a journey because through that, I've had to navigate two cultures in my life, is both the Western culture of what that looked like outside of my household and the internal and community culture I had within my home and with the Filipino community that I was surrounded by as a kid and all throughout my life since. And something that I found really interesting, especially as I tussled and was thinking about what I should do for work, because social work was definitely not on my parents' bingo card when I had options of what I could choose to be. I came across the word informal supports when I started working at Sagesse, and I realized that in being Filipino, we really utilize informal supports. Like when my parents arrived in Canada, it was a friend who picked them up, or a friend who knew my aunt actually instead and picked them up and was like, here, you're gonna need some winter jackets. It's minus 30 over here. It's not plus 40 like you see in the Philippines. And I've also seen the great gifts of informal support, and as well of now working in the social services sector, I've also seen the impacts of not knowing when we may need to ask for extra support from those who are more equipped or may have more knowledge around topics like mental health, gender-based violence, coercive control. And so that is just a very short and sweet version of how I've landed in this informal supports work. When I'm introducing Sagesse, and Trevor will also be talking to you about Real Talk, and he can give you more about his journey with informal supports then. Where I really want to start is that Sagesse is a peer support organization. And I always like to lead with that simply because it differentiates us a little bit from clinical practices in how we do things. And so as I talk to you about some of our values as an organization and what we believe in, please keep that in mind. I'm just sharing my screen and I'm just going to need your help. This is our first activity that we're doing together. Just by a show of reactions and hands, can you see my screen?
Yes, we can.
Awesome. Thank you so much. Not a trick question. Just wanted to make sure that no one's left behind because I am showing this. So today we are talking to you about Real Talk. And yes, the acronym is we're going to get real, but we've been really intentional of what the acronym means. And so this is just to give you all a little sneak peek into what real entails. And so as an organization, something I want to mention about Sagesse is me opening up about my informal supports work is me trying to actually lean into my authenticity, both as a professional, but also as a person, because at our organization, we believe that we are our values, or we should always be striving to emulate our values in the way that feels most authentic for us. And so at Sagesse, some of our core values as an organization is the belief that we should act with courage, vulnerability, curiosity, and to also trust in the messiness. And so now what I will say is that this looks different for every person who works at Sagesse, and they will talk about it a little bit differently. Organizationally, we're hoping to do things like lead into uncomfortable spaces, even if maybe that doesn't always reflect our own individual beliefs, values, and ideas, because we're always in pursuit of creating space for connection, creativity. We want to lean into vulnerability because, like I mentioned, right, we want people to be able to show up with authenticity, but that also includes ourselves in that equation. And when we talk about curiosity, all we hope as a prevention team is that we are facilitating spaces that allow people to maybe dig a little bit deeper, engage in conversations you maybe normally might not, or ask questions that you, I think I've heard people say, you know, they don't want to feel silly. We encourage the curiosity for people to break past that and ask it anyways. And then, of course, the one that we always get comments on is our value of trusting in the messiness. And that truly everyone is just that. As an org, Sagesse just knows that the work isn't linear, right? That is, there's going to be ups, downs, it's continuously evolving. So rather than us trying to suppress it or rebel against it, what we choose to do is actually sometimes recognize that the better thing to do is go through it together, to trust in the process, and know that wherever we end up, we're going to end up, and we'll be able to take a next step together afterwards. So that is just for to share a little bit about some of our values and help all of you maybe have a little bit more of a picture as to why me and Trevor may be talking the way that we are today, or if you attend a Real Talk in the future, just to know where we are coming from as both professionals and as an organization. And just to introduce that, we do have a couple pillars of work, but like I mentioned, we are from the prevention pillar of our work, but we do work multidisciplinary in multiple areas. So as Sagesse was exploring informal supports, something we really want to point out is, as Tracy mentioned earlier, informal supports are essential. The way I like to talk about it when I've done workshops with people is to remind everyone that we are all part of spheres of influence. And we see that reflected in the way that statistics are put out about about informal supports, as well as when we've done work around exploring domestic abuse, gender-based violence. And so one of the things I really want to say is that even if you are here today as a professional, what we know is that 80% of people are telling an informal supporter first. They're talking to their friends, they're talking to their coworkers, they're talking to all their loved ones. And so partly of our interest as an organization and working with informal supports is that we think that there is a major benefit to including the people who are naturally in our lives, because it helps us sustain, right? It helps us sustain and maintain what it means to feel connected, or to know that if things are not quite going the way that we had imagined, that there's going to be someone there who can help along that journey. And that is oftentimes going to be the people who are our natural supports or informal supports. But I'm really saying those fancy words, but I just mean we need our family, our friends, and our loved ones. Just again, by a show of hands, how familiar is everyone with, or actually maybe I could ask, if you have your own definition of domestic violence, would you mind quickly writing a sentence or a word or two that comes to your mind when you see or hear the word domestic abuse? I'm also just trying to open my chat. So if I am not responding quickly enough, I'm just trying to put that on my other screen. But yes, Tracy, right? It can look multiple ways: physical, emotional, mental, or spiritual. And so even as we look at our informal supports, something that we like to do as an organization is let people know how we define domestic abuse, so that you and I can share language. Or if you are thinking of it in a different way, it is not to say that anyone's definition is wrong. It is just to give us some grounding into how we may be talking about things the same, but also different. Yes, I see control in some way over another person in a relationship, absolutely. Emotional and mental, for sure. And so I'd say yes, some major things that we use to categorize domestic abuse is intimacy, dependency, and trust. We recognize that it can happen to anyone across the lifespan. We recognize that it can happen to one at even outside of intimate partner relationships, right? That's why there are such things as child abuse or elder abuse. And so here are some of the characteristics that we utilize when we are talking about abuse. And we recognize that the purpose of abuse is to control. And like I mentioned, it can happen at any time over someone's lifespan. So that is a little bit about us as Sagesse, an organization. You're all here to learn more about Real Talk. And so I want to leave all the good bits for Trevor to be able to talk to you more about Real Talk, the acronym, what it is, and who we serve when we are facilitating our Real Talks. I know he recently just gave an example about one of them being the energy sector. And then after Trevor, we'll open it up for all your questions. So if you've been holding on to any, just again, we are here to engage in dialogue with all of you.
Thank you so much, Lian. And I'm really excited to be here this morning as well, to be able to share about the work that we've been doing over the last few years, and to share a little bit about my story as well. I really like that we've grounded this time in a little bit of our stories, and I want to be able to share a bit more of my relationship with informal supports, as Lian gave that interesting prompt. And so I would say for myself, my parents were always a big influence on me. They were always very generous with their space and their resources. Basically, since the time I was 10, we had multiple iterations of either my mom's friends, my brother's friends, or my friends staying with my folks. And they would stay for sometimes a month, sometimes for a few years, depending on the people. And so my parents were always very generous with their space, and that always was something that stood out to me as a big value. Um, I was also raised in a strong faith community, and although I have a complicated relationship with that these days, still the values of justice, of community, of looking out for one another, of trying to build up strength and resilience and resist power was a big value that is absolutely influenced by that background as well. And then so as those sort of foundations have carried on in doing this work, unfortunately, I've had a number of friends who have opened up to me since starting to be in the domestic abuse sector about their own experiences, and different informal opportunities have come up that me and my partner have been able to try and help them navigate and figure out what we can do to help support people in as they're going through that. And as Lian said, and as we believe it suggests, they all go very different ways, right? And even though it might feel like some of them are at the end, they're not really. When I did this, I did a real talk in the summer in central Alberta, and I met with a social worker, and she had told me that she met with multiple people that were leaving an abusive relationship after 50 years of marriage. So in that sense of like, we just never know where people are at. We never know where we're intersecting and meeting people at, and what supports they need. And so for us, it's really about, just being able to provide that support, provide that humanity to someone who we think might need it in that particular way that each of us can, right? And that's really what our workshop is about. So the objectives for our workshop are, how can we empower informal supporters? So as Tracy and Lian both said, just friends, family members, colleagues, neighbors, anyone in our lives that we're not governed by policy, and how to interact. How can we empower each other to be able to feel like they can provide some sort of support to somebody? Now, that support isn't total. It's not the Hollywood romanticized, like you're going to come in and rescue somebody from their situation, but it's what's that next step that they need. Maybe it's emotional validation. Maybe they're going through something that's just really hard right now. Maybe it's a very practical thing. Maybe they need you to offer their phone, because if they use their phone, their history could compromise them, all sorts of things. Like maybe you can be practical in that sense. Maybe they need help picking up kids after work. Maybe they need somebody to talk to because it's a friend. And generally, as was brought up in the chat, thank you, Robin, a lot of times we don't think of friends abusing each other as well, right? Or all these different dynamics and relationships that we have where that intimacy, dependency, and control can exist. And so for us, it's equipping people that might not feel like they know how to do this, to have these hard conversations and to be supportive, and to spread awareness and normalize these conversations in places where I really like the way that Stops was alluded to it, Robin alluded to it, that there's a lot of system thinking, structural thinking. A lot of times we individualize these conversations, right? We individualize people's experiences of abuse. And what happens there is that just compounds that sense of isolation that people who are navigating abusive situations might be feeling. And so a part of this normalization and having these conversations is really important. Just yesterday, we were at the University of Calgary doing a real talk with med students, and the professors who are probably in their late 30s, 40s, they were saying how even these conversations we're having about the nuance around abuse, around the complexity and the informal supports and how to ask, they were saying that they didn't even have these conversations 15, 20 years ago when they were going through med school, and how it's starting to become more normal. They were told, well, if someone's experiencing abuse, just tell a social worker and that's it. And now their professors are starting to recognize that like they can have an impact even in 2-3 minutes of just a positive conversation, of a deep empathic connection, that they can help somebody feel validated and maybe take the next step or connect them to resources to do those pieces. And so that's a part of that normalization, that as we have these conversations in places where maybe they're not as used to doing it, or as a very simple solution before, that hasn't quite met the complexity, that as that becomes more and more normal, then the hope is that all these communities working together, all these institutions working together, formal and informal, we can ultimately do that prevention work of decreasing these incidences of violence that are occurring in our communities. So those are the big objectives. Honestly, it's for everybody. We do real talks with faith communities, education. So education can be anything from like big universities, trade schools, high schools, and junior highs. We're doing them with settler, indigenous, and newcomer communities. We're doing them with nonprofits and informal communities. We've had really good success lately with community associations. So all over, just kind of like email blasting, seeing who's interested, saying, hey, here's what we're talking about. And we're getting a pretty good response for that. We're having them with the energy sector. We were invited out last week to Sagesse, one of the reserves around Calgary here, to go to their junior high school and to talk about these things there. And so I should say, I also did one with my brother and my father. We talk about these things. We have different ways that we're engaging in the conversation. So we have one that's for men as well, because we recognize that gender plays a huge part in the domestic abuse, violence situations that are occurring across our country. We know that men both experience it and tend to perpetuate it. And so how do we talk about that paradox of vulnerability and power? So we look at those pieces. And then we adjust based on who we're talking to. So with the med students, we talked about it from being a doctor, from a doctor's position where technically they are formal supports, but they're not formal abuse supports. So how do they feel about that? Where do they feel comfortable? With faith leaders who sometimes feel like, oh, I only do marriages or eulogies and sermons, but I'm not a social worker. It's trying to build that confidence and that importance in people that are kind of there already, that are being talked to possibly already, and let them know that they can have that next sort of step of influence and of support, to be in that 80% gap, and hopefully then be able to help somebody connect to a more formal resource if that's what the person wants. And so how people access this is, we have a few different ways. We have online drop-ins that were already mentioned. We do those a couple times a month. We have both a general real talk where we don't necessarily focus on how men are doing in particular or not. And then we also have one that is for men in particular. And then the other ways we do it is through building connections, through networking. And that's I like that process because it's a big puzzle, right? How do we connect to communities, especially when our goal is like, who do we think is less connected, but still meeting together? So that'd be something like community associations where they're not a part of the nonprofit, or typically they wouldn't come to mind, like when I think of like disabilities, homelessness, child and family wellness. And yet they are technically nonprofits, and they're very much in the heart of all of our communities. And so there is that real potential there of connecting with them that's very interesting. So for that we would just do like email blast campaigns, send out 150 and see what kind of sticks for that. Sometimes it's exactly what happened earlier, where I can't remember, was it Suzanne? Suzanne was talking about community, and then Jody had said, hey, like maybe we could talk. Sometimes that happens as well for networking, right? In these types of situations, how people can access it. And then for us, we're able to go to communities as well. So we've been to Hinton and to Westlock, Alberta. We're going up to Nisku. We're looking at maybe going to Grand Prairie at some point this year. Hopefully when the roads are a little bit better. But we're going down to Crow's Nest Pass and really trying to like our mandate is provincial wide, and though we are based out of Calgary, we're trying to ensure that we're not just provincial wide, but we do Calgary, Edmonton, and Red Deer, because that can sometimes happen with these kinds of mandates. And so we're really trying to build connections, um, and and it's a lot of trial and error and just creativity and like, who do you think might be interested in these conversations? Because we find that in almost every type of sector, there's at least some people that are interested in talking about these things. And so it's just figuring out how to find those folks, right? That's where it's that kind of creative process. So we think that Real Talk is helpful because we've heard we heard from the doctors yesterday that they said this is really important for doctors to know. It was important for them to do the trade-off of time, right? How do they manage time? Even in our formal supports, I like how we talk both about the informal roles and formal roles, but there's informal spaces even in our formal roles too. Even in clinical settings, when you're at the door and somebody's coming or going, they might share something. They might tell you something there. That's not the official space where you're supposed to do the engagement necessarily, but a part of Real Talk is being able to do that engagement at that point, right? And so we go through the acronym of recognize, empathize, ask, and listen. We highlight those things, and they're very introductory to a lot of these conversations, right? So after we do the recognize piece, we look at empathize, and in that part, one of the thoughts we might think is, well, this person must be okay if they haven't left yet. And we know that that's not necessarily true. As we talk about in our first section, there's a lot of reasons why someone might stay in an abusive relationship or a situation. It's not necessarily a romantic relationship, but a situation. We know that there are better ways to ask. So sometimes, even though if you love somebody, even if you care about somebody and have the right intention, you still might not have the best delivery. So like, for example, telling someone they should just leave their situation and go to the shelter, that might not be the best way to intervene because there could be a lot of factors that you don't know. So we talk about that and how to ask better empathic questions, how to validate people is really important. How to ask questions so you understand better what's happening in someone's story, how it's impacting them, and what they need, right? So you can figure out what those practical pieces are. When we talk about how to listen and the honoring of people's experiences and their choices and what's been happening and what they're sharing. And then we get into the complicated other part of how do you support somebody who might be navigating or engaging in abuse. And so that has also happened since I've started this role, and that's a lot harder to build rapport, I find. I've had friends who have known that I've started this kind of work who I think might not be doing the best behavior, and I try and want to talk about, but they now only want to meet with me in a group setting, so that we don't bring it up, which is understandable on their part, I suppose. But it gets complicated, right? It gets messy, and a part of that prevention work is that we think that people that are engaging in this abuse also need support, right? That they need support, and if we are actually going to prevent it, we have to hold those that are doing it accountable, and we have to offer that support as well, right? And figure out how to navigate those two pieces of that paradox. And so when we've been doing that, I've had men, we ask one question that's maybe my favorite in the whole workshop, in the section of balancing the support and accountability of what would you hope to gain if you stop this behavior? Then men weep at that question. And they told me that their adult children have said to them, we could have a better relationship with you if you worked on your anger. And this guy knew, he said, I know what I have to do, and it's going to take time. It's going to take being intentional. It's going to take work. And so I hope that he's been able to do that, right? He had that realization. I hope he's been able to do that. Yeah, and so we've heard those kinds of responses from community. I met a few folks from a church in the middle of Alberta who were helping multiple people that were on the way to jail for abusive behavior. they were offering that support in that process before they were incarcerated, because they knew they might need emotional support as well, right? And so we're hearing people doing this work, and it's really profound. It's really humbling, and we think and hope that, and ultimately, I mean, that's the nature of prevention. Is like it's really hard to show evidence for prevention, right? Like in a world that's very evidence-based, it's a difficult thing to do, and yet it makes sense to do, right? It's got a profound logic behind it of, if we can go upstream and figure out what's happening for folks, then we can help, right? And our communities collectively, not us individually, but our communities collectively can have that impact on folks. And so all that to say, that I'm really excited to be here. I'm excited that the program is expanding into Saskatchewan, and I'm very curious to see how the learnings here in Alberta will be able to translate over, and then what some of those new learnings are going to be in Saskatchewan. As although we are prairie buddies, we are different provinces at the same time. So I think that is it for my thoughts for now. Should we open it up to questions, or Nofa, would you like to take the next step?
Well, I do want to just mention one thing, everyone, just before we pass it to you, Nofa. If you are curious, because we did take the time to write down some of the things you were hoping to gain from today. Some of you were looking for just more information. Some of you were looking for supports. And so essentially the place that we want to end off is, we hope you've appreciated our anecdotes and some of our learnings of, like, as we've operated here in Alberta. And something we also want to give to you is, we highly encourage you and we challenge you of, if you are not well versed in some of the formal supports that you have available, we hope that you walk away from today and start to dig into that a little bit more about what is their lens, what do they value, because values for people are a big thing when they are seeking support and who they would like to open up to. We also want to mention that we highly encourage you to attend one of our Real Talks. We've only given you a tidbit of all of the things that we cover and all of the things that are going to be discussed in that time. And so that is why we have Jody here. And so if you are interested to just get more information about Real Talk itself and what is that going to look like, please reach out to Stops. But I will also be dropping Jody's information in the chat here if you'd like to just have a one-on-one conversation, because to us, we also know that sometimes meeting for coffee or a virtual coffee is much better than anything. The connection is irreplaceable. So we also just want to say thank you, and thank you to everyone for giving us space and your time today. So